After studying this module, you will be able to learn about the structure and functions of the spinal cord, learn about the fissures, sulci and gyri which make up two hemispheres and the four major lobes of the cerebral cortex. Learn the functions of the frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital lobes of the cerebral cortex. Learn about primary and secondary areas of various lobes of the cerebral cortex. Learn about specialized functions in some areas of the cerebral cortex. The nervous system is the body's decision making and communication center. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the spinal and the cranial nerves. Together, they control every part of one's life from breathing and blinking to memory and thinking. The spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long conical structure approximately as thick as an adult's finger. The spinal cord begins at the occipital bone and extends down to the space between the first and second lumbar vertebrae. It is around 45 centimeters in men and around 43 centimeters long in women. The principal function of the spinal cord is to distribute motor fibers to the effector organs of the body, which are the glands and muscles, and to collect somatosensory information to be passed on to the brain. The spinal cord has three major functions. First, as a conduit for motor information which travels down the spinal cord. Second, as a conduit for sensory information in the reverse direction. And finally, as a center for coordinating simple and complex reflexes. Brain is the highest information processing center in the nervous system. It has three main divisions: the forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. The nervous system is divided into telencephalon, which includes cerebral cortex and basal ganglia, the diencephalon, which includes thalamus and hypothalamus, mesencephalon, which includes superior and inferior colliculi, metencephalon, pons, cerebellum and myencephalon, which includes the medulla oblongata. The broader divisions of the brain are the forebrain, midbrain and the hindbrain. The forebrain consists of cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus, which are part of the limbic system. The midbrain consists of the tectum and tegmentum. The hindbrain is made of the cerebellum, pons and medulla. The midbrain, pons and medulla are referred to together as the brain stem. Hemispheres. If you look at the brain from the top, it becomes immediately obvious that it is split in two from front to back. There are in fact two hemispheres, almost as if we have two brains in our heads instead of just one. Of course, these two halves are intimately linked together with an arch of white matter called the corpus callosum. The two hemispheres look like mirror images of each other. In various ways, researchers have discovered that the two halves do have some specialization. It is the left hemisphere that relates to the right side of the body generally, and the right hemisphere that relates to the left side of the body. Also, it is the left hemisphere that usually has language and seems to be primarily responsible for similar systems such as maths and logic. The right hemisphere has more to do with things like spatial orientation, face recognition and body image. It also seems to govern our ability to appreciate art and music. It is primarily concerned with expression and comprehension of emotions. The cerebrum is a Latin word for brain. It is the largest part of the brain as a whole. It is here that functions like perception, imagination, thought, judgment and decision making occur. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. Cortex means bark and the cerebral cortex surrounds the cerebral hemisphere like the bark of a tree. It is greatly convoluted. It is composed of 6 thin layers of neurons which sit on top of a large collection of white matter, that is fibers or pathways. The cortex is heavily convoluted. It includes billions of neurons with trillions of synapses. The convolutions have ridges which are called gyri and gyrus if it is called in singular, and valleys which are called sulci, and the singular is sulcus. Some of the sulci are quite pronounced and long and serve as convenient boundaries between 4 areas of the cerebrum called lobes. The regions of the brain. Different regions of the cerebral cortex perform different functions. The primary visual cortex receives visual information. Located primarily on the upper and lower banks of calcarine fissure in the occipital lobe of the brain. The primary auditory cortex receives auditory information. Located primarily on the upper surface of the deep fissure, the lateral fissure in the temporal lobe of the brain. The primary somatosensory cortex receives information from body sensations. A vertical strip of cortex just caudal to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe of the brain, constitutes the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary motor cortex is involved in the control of motor movements and is located just in front of the primary somatosensory cortex in the frontal lobe of the brain. In anatomy, a lobe is a clear anatomical division or extension of an organ such as the brain, the breast or the kidney that can be determined without the use of a microscope at the gross anatomy level. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 lobes named for the bones of the skull that cover them: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. The brain contains 2 of each lobe, one in each of the 2 hemispheres. Frontal lobe. Located behind the forehead is the frontal lobe, from the Latin word for forehead. This lobe is responsible for voluntary movement and planning and is thought to be the most significant lobe for personality and intelligence. In humans, it reaches full maturity around 20 years of age, marking the cognitive maturity associated with adulthood. The frontal lobe is found in the brain of mammals. It contains most of the dopamine sensitive neurons in the cerebral cortex. The dopamine system is associated with reward, attention, short-term memory tasks, planning and motivation. Dopamine tends to limit and select sensory information arriving from the thalamus to the forebrain. The frontal lobe is located at the front of each cerebral hemisphere and positioned anterior to, that is in front of, the parietal lobe and superior and anterior to the temporal lobes. Its posterior boundary is the fissure of Rolando or central sulcus, which separates it from the parietal lobe. Inferior to it, it is divided from the temporal lobe by the fissure of Sylvius, which is also called the lateral fissure. The frontal lobe can be divided into a lateral, polar, orbital, which is above the orbit, also known as basal or ventral, and medial part. Each of these parts consist of particular gyri, and these gyri are separated by sulci. The back portion of frontal lobe contains the motor strip or motor cortex. It is immediately anterior to the central sulcus. It also consists of the Broca's area, that is found on the inferior third frontal gyrus in the hemisphere. The most anterior part of the frontal lobe is involved in complex cognitive processes like reasoning and judgment. These processes are called biological intelligence of an individual. A component of biological intelligence is executive function. The executive function regulates and directs cognitive processes, decision making, problem solving, learning, reasoning and strategic thinking. The higher level cognitive functions or executive functions of the frontal lobes are associated with the prefrontal cortex. These involve the ability to recognize future consequences resulting from current actions, to choose between good and bad actions, override and suppress socially unacceptable responses, and determine similarities and differences between things or events. It also plays an important part in retaining long-term memory, which is not task-based. These are often memories associated with emotions derived from input from the brain's limbic system. It modifies these emotions to generally fit socially acceptable norms. Damage to the frontal lobe can result in mood changes, social differences, and memory failures. More importantly, the frontal lobe contains several cortical areas that are involved in the control of voluntary muscle movements, including those necessary for the production of speech and swallowing. The Broca's area is found on the inferior third frontal gyrus in the hemisphere that is dominant for language. This area is involved in the coordination or programming of motor movements for the production of speech sounds. It is essential for the execution of the motor movements involved in speech, but does not directly cause movement to occur. This area is also involved in syntax, which involves the ordering of words, and morphology, that is, the allomorphs at the ends of words. Example, hat plus s is equal to hats. Any damage to this may cause apraxia or Broca's aphasia. The frontal lobe consists of the precentral gyrus, which may also be called the primary motor cortex. It controls the voluntary movements of skeletal muscles. The major pyramidal and extrapyramidal systems of the brain, which control various kinds of muscular movements, originate from here. The lowest portions of the motor cortex, closest to the temples, control the muscles of the mouth and face. The portions of the motor cortex near the top of the head control the legs and feet. The premotor area or supplemental motor area is immediately anterior to the motor strip. It is responsible for the programming for motor movements. It does not, however, program the motor commands for speech, as these are generated in Broca's area, which is also located in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the largest structure of the brain and therefore is associated with a large number of psychological disorders. These include ADHD, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. Hence, a large number of psychological tests are made to measure the frontal lobe function, including finger tapping, Wisconsin card sorting task, and other measures of verbal and figural fluency. Parietal lobe. Behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, from a Latin word meaning wall. This lobe is associated with sensation, including the sense of touch, kinesthesia, perception of warmth and cold, and of vibration. It is also involved in writing and in some aspects of reading. It further plays an important role in integrating sensory information from various senses and in the manipulation of objects. Certain portions of the parietal lobe are involved with visuospatial processing. The angular gyrus is involved in the recognition of visual symbols. Further, this lobe is divided into two hemispheres, left and right. The left hemisphere is involved in symbolic functions in language and mathematics. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is specialized in carrying out images and the understanding of maps, that is, spatial relationships in a three-dimensional world. Some portions of the parietal lobes are also important in language processing. The presensory, secondary sensory, or sensory association areas are located behind the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. These areas are capable of detailed discrimination and analysis. Information is first processed in the primary sensory area and is then sent to the secondary sensory areas. This region also receives sensory feedback from joints and tendons in the body and is organized in the same manner as the motor strip. It integrates sensory information from different modalities, particularly specializes in determining spatial sense and navigation. Its regions are enabled to map objects perceived visually into body coordinate positions. Its function also includes processing information relating to the sense of touch. The posterior parietal cortex is often referred to as the dorsal stream of vision. This dorsal stream has been called both the where stream as in spatial vision and the how stream as in vision for action. The posterior parietal cortex receives somatosensory or visual input, which then through motor signals controls movements of the arm, hand as well as eye movements. Damage to the parietal lobe may result in disorders that are dominant in speech and language, such as anomia, alexia with agraphia, left-right disorientation, finger agnosia and acalcalia. The parietal lobe is immediately posterior to the central sulcus. It is anterior to the occipital lobe, from which it is not separated by any natural boundary. Its inferior boundary is the posterior portion of the lateral fissure which divides it from the temporal lobe. It is defined by three anatomical boundaries. The central sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal and occipital lobes. The lateral sulcus is the most lateral boundary separating it from the temporal lobe, and the medial longitudinal fissure divides the two hemispheres. The postcentral gyrus, which is also called the primary sensory area or the sensory strip, is immediately posterior to the central sulcus. Like the motor strip, the sensory strip continues down into the longitudinal cerebral fissure and so has both a lateral and a medial aspect. This lobe also contains the angular gyrus. Fibers of many different types travel through the angular gyrus, including axons associated with hearing, vision and meaning. Further, it includes an area called the somatosensory cortex just behind the sulcus, separating this lobe from the frontal lobe. The somatosensory cortex can be mapped with the mouth and face closest to the temples and the legs and feet at the top of the head. Within each hemisphere, the somatosensory cortex represents the skin area on the contralateral surface of the body. Temporal lobe. At the side of the head is the temporal lobe, from the Latin word for temple. The special area of the temporal lobe is the auditory cortex. As the name says, this area is associated with auditory processing and olfaction and hence is intimately connected with the ears. It is connected with the parietal and frontal lobes and plays an important role in sensing of smell and sound as well as processing of complex stimuli like faces and scenes. The temporal lobe is divided into the left temporal lobe and the right temporal lobe. The two together provide a process of communication called lateralization. This allows communication between the left and the right temporal lobe as well as between the occipital, parietal and frontal lobes of the brain. This facilitates the retention of visual memories, facial recognition, sensory input processing, language comprehension, new memory storage and emotions. Further, this lobe is involved in semantics or word meaning. It contains the vernix area that is dominant for language. This area plays a critical role in the ability to understand and produce meaningful speech. There are two secondary auditory or auditory association areas which are a part of the vernix area and make important contributions to the comprehension of speech. Heschel's gyrus is the area in the temporal lobe where sound first reaches the brain. It is also known as the anterior transverse temporal gyrus and is the primary auditory area. The temporal lobe contains the hippocampus and plays a role in the formation of explicit long-term memory modulated by the amygdala. It plays an important role in processing of sensory input. Specific processing areas have been discovered in the temporal cortex. Auditory processing, adjacent areas in the superior, posterior and lateral parts of the temporal lobes are involved in high-level auditory processing. The temporal lobe is involved in primary auditory perception such as hearing and holds the primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex receives sensory information from the middle ear and secondary areas process the information into meaningful units such as speech and words. Visual processing. The areas associated with vision in the temporal lobe interpret the meaning of visual stimuli and establish object recognition. The ventral part of the temporal cortices appear to be involved in high-level visual processing of complex stimuli such as faces and senses. Anterior parts of this ventral stream for visual processing are involved in object perception and recognition. Language comprehension. The left temporal lobe holds the primary auditory cortex, which is important for the processing of semantics in both speech and vision in humans. Wernicke's area, which spans the region between temporal and parietal lobes, plays a key role in speech comprehension. The function of the left temporal lobe extends to comprehension, naming, verbal memory, etc. New memories. The medial temporal lobes are thought to be involved in encoding declarative long-term memory. The medial temporal lobes include the hippocampus, which is essential for memory storage. Therefore, damage to this area can result in impairment in new memory formation, leading to permanent or temporary anterograde amnesia, that is memory loss of recent events. The medial temporal lobe consists of structures that are vital for declarative or long-term memory. Declarative or explicit memory is conscious memory divided into semantic memory and episodic memory. The temporal lobe is located beneath the lateral fissure on both cerebral hemispheres of the mammalian brain. It is anterior to the occipital lobe. It is separated from the occipital lobe by an imaginary line rather than any natural boundary. The Wernicke's area is located on the first temporal gyrus on the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus in the hemisphere. It includes the medial temporal lobe, the structure of which includes the amygdala, brainstem and hippocampus along with the surrounding hippocampal regions. The superior temporal gyrus includes an area where auditory signals from the cochlea first reach the cerebral cortex and are processed by the primary auditory cortex in the left temporal lobe. Occipital lobe. At the back of the head is the occipital lobe. At the very back of the occipital lobe is the visual cortex, which receives information from the eyes and specializes thereby in vision. It is the visual processing center of the mammalian brain, containing most of the anatomical region of the visual cortex. This lobe contains the primary visual area or cortex, which receives input from the optic tract via the thalamus. The secondary visual areas integrate visual information, giving meaning to what is seen by relating the current stimulus to past experiences and knowledge. A lot of memory is stored in this area. These areas are superior to the primary visual cortex. The occipital lobe is divided into several functional visual areas. Each visual area contains a full map of the visual world, although there are no anatomical markers distinguishing these areas. Damage to the primary visual area causes blind spots in the visual field or total blindness depending on the extent of the injury. Damage to the secondary visual areas could cause visual agnosia. People with this condition can see visual stimuli but cannot associate them with any meaning or identify their function. This represents a problem with meaning as compared to anomia, which involves a problem with naming or word recall. Occipital lesions can cause visual hallucinations. Lesions in the parietal temporal occipital association area are associated with color agnosia, movement agnosia, and agraphia. A lesion somewhere in V1 could lead to a hole in the vision called scotoma. Yet, some of the information from that hole seems to be available so that some people with scotomas can still react to stimuli. This is called blind sight. The occipital lobe is the smallest of the lobes and sits at the very back of the head. It is the most posterior lobe and has no natural boundaries on its lateral aspect. The primary visual cortex is called V1 or visual 1, which is located on the medial side of the occipital lobe within the calcarine sulcus. The full extent of visual 1 often continues onto the posterior pole of the occipital lobe. Visual 1 is often also called striate cortex. Visually driven regions outside visual 1 are called extrastriate cortex. The two occipital lobes are the smallest of four paired lobes in the human cerebral cortex. Located in the rearmost portion of the skull, the occipital lobes are part of the forebrain. The cortical lobes are not defined by any internal structural features, but rather by the bones of the skull that overlie them. Thus, the occipital lobe is defined as the part of the cerebral cortex that lies underneath the occipital bone. The lobes rest on the tentorium cerebelli, a process of durameter that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. They are structurally isolated in their respective cerebral hemispheres by the separation of the cerebral fissure. At the front edge of the occipital are several lateral occipital gyri, which are separated by lateral occipital sulcus. The occipital aspects along the inside face of each hemisphere are divided by the calcarine sulcus. Above the medial, Y-shaped sulcus lies the concus, and the area below the sulcus is the lingual gyrus. Broadmans areas. Broadman generated a map of the cortex covering the lobes of each hemisphere. He numbered the areas that he studied in each lobe and recorded the psychological and behavioral events that accompanied their stimulation. The areas of the lobes that are not specialized are called association cortex. Besides connecting the various sensory and motor cortices, this is also believed to be where our thought processes occur and many of our memories are ultimately stored. Summary. There are four prominent lobes of the brain. Each lobe consists of primary, secondary and association areas. The frontal lobe is specialized for logical thinking, problem solving, decision making, reasoning and other higher order cognitive functions. It is also the highest center controlling motor behavior. It also has some role too in speech. The parietal cortex is somatosensory. It mediates the sense of touch, temperature, pressure, pain, spatio-manipulable activities, learning of second language, etc. Temporal cortex involves sense of hearing and the vestibular or equilibrium. Occipital cortex is involved with visual perception of complex and integrated visual stimuli.